I am Flavia Belliani Zimmerman from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia. And today we have with us Professor Mark Beeson from the University of Western Australia. And we'll be discussing Professor Beeson's new books, Environmental Anarchy, Security in the 21st Century. Thank you for being with us, Professor Beeson.
Pleasure.
Professor Beeson, can you please explain what you mean by environmental anarchy and how it affects peace and security in the 21st century?
Well, the idea of environmental anarchy draws on the concept in international relations, which is very famous and prominent, which is the idea that the international relations system is anarchical. And it's just a way of conceptualizing relations between individual states. And the idea is there's no supreme authority to impose order, justice, or anything else on individual sovereign states. And it's a sort of war against all against all, and you have to rely on yourself for your survival. Now, one of the problems of that model, well, there are a lot of problems with it in my view, but one of them is that it doesn't really offer a way forward in thinking about how to deal with something like climate change, which threatens national security, but it's impossible for any individual state to actually do anything about it on their own. So if we are to address climate change in a significant way, and I've got some reservations about whether that's actually possible, but if we are to do that, then it will require unprecedented levels of cooperation, and it will require forms of organization that fly in the face of that kind of picture of anarchical behavior in a state of, in an interstate system where states compete with each other. So that's the kind of basic premise, thinking about what international relations theory can or can't tell us about the situation we're in, and also thinking about the actual impact of that kind of way of thinking about the international system in the first place. Because if policymakers really think that they are involved in a war of all against all, and it's all about looking after yourself or nobody's going to help you, then it's very unlikely we're going to actually get to a point where we can agree to cooperate and do something about it.
Thank you so much. And I mean, just following a bit what you were explaining about the book and some realist perspectives to the anarchical international system and environmental issues. In your view, and I'm not sure whether you tackled this in your book, but in your view, what are the leading challenges for world leaders to introduce policies tackling climate change?
Some of them are technical, and the good news is that there are lots of smart people out there who have some very good ideas about what could be done about changing the economic basis of modern capitalist economies to make them less resource dependent and less and more sustainable. So there are lots of good ideas about what can be done, and there are some potentially good technical solutions to some of the problems that we face. The problem is that a lot of the people who have those kinds of ideas don't get much of a look in when it comes to making important policy decisions that will actually affect the outcome of these kinds of changes. And Australia is a classic example of this, where our government is very reluctant to commit itself to a target for reducing carbon emissions, for example, despite the fact that there's overwhelming evidence about Australia's contribution to this problem and about the impact that global warming is actually having on Australia itself. And despite the fact that we have many world-renowned experts on climate change and possible solutions to climate change in Australia, the government doesn't take the slightest notice of them. And that's a kind of microcosm of the problem that we face internationally, because even though people like Joe Biden are making encouraging noises about what should be done, the fact that they still prioritize this growing competition with China, for example, and the kind of great power contestation that underpins that, is not encouraging when thinking about what the basis for cooperation is likely to be. Because if the United States and China don't cooperate, then people like Scott Morrison saying it doesn't make any difference what we do, in some ways that's going to be correct, because it won't make that much difference, but that's a recipe for continuing inaction across the world. And if that's the case, then our prospects don't look good, to put it mildly.
Thank you. And when we think about, I mean, you're talking about the role of the United States and China in perhaps being more assertive regarding policies tackling climate change. And when we think about the responsibility of international actors and states as well to tackle climate change, what do you think would be their role? What could um, international actors as well as states do to tackle climate change?
Sure. Well, I mean, whether we like it or not, states are still the most important and powerful actors in the world. And I think without exception, almost states are preoccupied with protecting their national security and sovereignty. And that's true of the United States and it's true of China. I mean, the great hope in these kinds of debates, and about the only example we've got of really effective institutionalized transnational cooperation across national borders, is the European Union. And unfortunately, the European Union's got lots of problems of its own and internal tensions with populist leaders emerging in Eastern Europe and various other things. But they have made some progress in putting together a serious agenda of internal reform and cooperation within the European Union. Despite lots of obstacles and difficulties, and actually having to pioneer that process themselves. So there are some examples. They're not perfect, but they're better than not having any examples at all. And they do suggest that if the political will was there, then it is possible for states to cooperate in pursuit of collective goals. And I mean, the point is that if we don't do that, then everybody's going to be responding to climate change eventually, but they're going to be doing it in much less favorable circumstances. I mean, some people think it's already, in some ways, too late to address some of the really major problems, and we're going to have to cope with increased amounts of global warming and the kind of environmental and consequences for the weather that we already see around us. But even so, if we don't do anything at all, we can guarantee that things are going to get much worse in the future, and the conditions in which we try to encourage cooperation will probably disappear fairly fast, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much. And perhaps wrapping up our interview, and perhaps to also work a little bit on the willingness of state actors to tackle climate change. In your view, and I'm not sure whether you highlight this in any of your chapters, but how climate change will affect peace and security in the Indo-Pacific and particularly in Australia?
Well, I think we're already seeing the impacts in Australia, because I mean, the last couple of summers have been appalling, and there's been direct threats to the lives and livelihoods of ordinary people across Australia. And if that's not a security threat, I don't know what one looks like personally. So that's one pretty tangible bit of evidence about what's going on. But in terms of the world, I think the unfortunate thing is that some of the poorer countries in the world who've done the least to contribute to the problem in the first place are going to be the most badly affected. And some people think that some parts of the world will become literally uninhabitable because they'll be too hot to live in, literally, and the underlying environmental conditions will be incapable of supporting life in the kinds of, in any form possibly, but at the most stark. And the consequences of that, I mean, if I was living in one of those areas, I'd want to go somewhere else. So migration and people choosing to vote with their feet to try and go somewhere else that's more sustainable is going to be an increasing feature of as far as we can see, I think. And the consequences of that could be absolutely horrendous, because rich countries that can preserve their environment more successfully, and those countries that are favorable. There's an article in today's paper about New Zealand, Tasmania, Ireland, and Great Britain being the best countries to be in the event of an environmental apocalypse, because they're reasonably easy to defend, they've got good basic infrastructure, and they won't be as hot as some of the other places. So they'll last longer than everywhere else, but they'll have to fend off would-be immigrants in some fairly drastic manner if they want to preserve that and keep it in one piece. So the future scenarios you can paint about some of these things are pretty apocalyptic. And the striking thing is, why is it that security experts and those charged with keeping us safe, apparently? Why is it that they don't recognize this and think about it in more creative ways while there's still the opportunity, rather than preparing themselves to deal with this in the way that those kind of strategic elites have always done, which is to buy increasing amounts of military hardware to protect their kind of zone of peace in the face of zones of increasing conflict and mayhem. So it's not a pretty picture, but it's one that we really have to think about, because if we don't, I mean, climate change is coming to get us. I just don't think there's any doubt about that at all.
Thank you, Mark. And just, final reflections on how to tackle environmental anarchy. What is, let's say, the main message you would like to send to world leaders to avoid this climatic apocalypse?
Well, I mean, just recognize what's going on, first of all, and acknowledge the seriousness of what's going on. Recognize that they are possibly uniquely placed to actually do something about it. Recognize that there's an undercurrent and a much more visible group and larger group of people who do recognize this and want world leaders to act as soon as possible, if not immediately, to take really drastic sorts of action to address the problem that we are racing towards. So I think just that basic unambiguous willingness to commit to political action on a cooperative basis before it's too late is what we actually need. And I don't think they're going to take the slightest notice of me, I have to say, but there are lots of smart people around who they should be taking notice of. And they often have these people in their governments, but they don't take any notice of people that they don't want to hear messages from. So that's part of the problem. So, how we get the likes of Greta Thunberg to have more influence on this kind of thinking is an interesting but encouraging thing. So, I mean, young people, I think, do get this. And part of the problem is a lot of the people who are running the world at the moment aren't young and don't face the same kind of existential peril that young people do. But if they've got kids and grandkids, they should take this seriously, because they're going to inherit the mess that we're creating for them.
Thank you very much, Professor Beeson. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Sorry, it's so gloomy.
But realistic. Thank you for being with us. And for more information, please visit our website, www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.
Thank you.